I was halfway through my third cup of coffee when the envelope slid under Wolfe's door, its edges sealed with wax-stamped Le Cordon Noir. Wolfe didn't even glance up from his chessboard. He never did for mail. I picked it up, turned, eyed it over in my hand, and noted the embossed initials, FC, and the slight smell of lemon oil. Before I could stuff it into the wastebasket, Wolfe's head tilted as if the envelope had spoken. "Read it," he said, voice dry as dust. I tore the seal. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored parchment and a clipped newspaper column about the imminent publication of Marcel Chou's legendary culinary tome, Le Grand Appétit. The note claimed there was an unlisted chapter missing from every advance copy, a sequence of recipes so revolutionary that its disappearance had cost its author both fortune and reputation. The writer, a former sous chef at Chou's Parisian kitchen, begged Wolfe to recover this extra chapter before the book went to press. Wolfe drummed his fingers against the table, eyes narrowing. "An unlisted chapter," he murmured. "Intriguing." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. In Wolfe's world, a lost dessert recipe could be as deadly serious as a murder weapon. He leaned back, fingers steepled, and regarded me. "Well, Goodwin," he said, "fetch me the publisher's details and locate this sous chef. Our brownstone has a reputation to maintain." And just like that, the quiet sanctity of 454 West 35th was disturbed. I grabbed my coat. This case promised not blood, but sabotage of the most refined sort. And Wolfe had taken the bait. By the time I returned with the publisher's dossier, address in Midtown, name of the reluctant sous chef, Lucien Marceau, and frantic letters from Parisian agents. The brownstone's front hall had already surrendered its usual hush to clattering heels. Theodore Horowitz, publisher for Le Cordon Noir Press, stood stiff as a valet before Wolfe's tulipwood desk, cheeks flushed, under the weight of his own anxiety. He thrust a leather portfolio toward Wolfe, rattling it like a nervous percussionist. Wolfe barely stirred his napkin. "Mr. Wolfe," Horowitz gulped, "our entire print run is at risk. Chou's extra chapter could upend culinary history or destroy our reputation if it's fraudulent. I implore you to secure it." Wolfe drummed a finger against the tabletop, eyes locked on Horowitz's trembling portfolio. Outside the office door, Fritz paced. Evelyn stood clutching a silver tray of untouched afternoon tea, and Saul Panzer lingered, instinct tuned for opportunity. Archie Goodwin, that would be me, felt the walls close in, the brownstone's sanctity breached by suits, secrets, and spicy intrigue. I'd have preferred a simple break-in or a safe cracking job, but here we were, menacing a chef's honor rather than a corpse. Still, Wolfe's cool gaze promised the usual intellectual siege. Outsiders meddling where they didn't belong, a hermetic fortress to defend, and a master strategist ready to stake his claim, without moving an inch. I've seen murder suspects, with cleaner motives and calmer nerves than the crowd circling this missing chapter. What started as a culinary hiccup was ballooning into something thicker than bechamel and just as likely to curdle. Wolfe sat, unmoved as ever, letting me do the interviewing, sniffing out the contradictions and, let's be honest, dealing with the heat. That's what I'm here for. That and getting coffee that meets Wolfe's Himalayan standards. But this time, even I had to admit, we weren't just dealing with a torn recipe page. We were dealing with egos, vendettas, and secrets cooked too, long under pressure. I started with Lucien Marceau, the former sous chef who'd penned the original letter. He was staying at a boutique hotel in Murray Hill under the name M. Renard, which, loosely translated, meant Mr. Fox. Cute. He was pale, nervy, and twitching like a soufflé near collapse. He opened the door in a monogrammed silk robe and tried to pretend he wasn't thrilled someone was taking him seriously. "Yes," he whispered before I'd introduced myself. "The chapter exists. It was mine." "Yours?" Marcel stole. Or let's say he absorbed it. We worked together on the experimental dishes, the final 10 recipes, pure collaboration. And when he fled Paris with the manuscript, that chapter was left behind, unfinished, unsigned, unpublished. And now he claims it never existed. But it did. Ask Estelle. She was there. Estelle? His wife. Still is, unfortunately. She typed every word. He pressed a flash drive into my hand, muttering something about proof, then slammed the door before I could ask more. I had questions, a lot of them, but he was already deadbolting the door like a man expecting ghosts. Back at the brownstone, I downloaded the contents to Wolfe's secure server, while Fritz hovered like the Secret Service over a fondue pot. Wolfe didn't look up from his book on Turkish rose varieties, but gave a soft grunt. That was the closest he'd come to approval, all day. "Proceed, Archie," he murmured, "but proceed with discrimination." Next stop was Estelle Chou, former kitchen assistant, current wife, or possibly widow, of the legendary Marcel. She answered the door of her Gramercy apartment wearing gardening gloves and a face that said, "I've had enough of men with notebooks." She sized me up, then invited me into a room that smelled faintly of time, fresh paint, and the kind of disappointment that simmers for decades. "I know why you're here," she said before I'd asked. "No, I didn't keep a copy. Marcel was obsessive. He made me burn my drafts. I told Lucien they were lost. He didn't believe me then, and he doesn't believe me now." Did Marcel ever acknowledge the collaboration? Not publicly? Privately? Every night. He'd recite Lucien's names beside the dishes like some twisted benediction, but when it came time to publish, the publisher wanted a clean product, singular genius, not a shared one. And now the chapter's missing? Oh, it was. Missing before they even noticed. Marcel stripped it before delivery, said it was too unrefined for his legacy. She didn't flinch when I mentioned Lucien's accusations, but her jaw tensed like she was remembering old arguments. I believed her, mostly. But I also knew grief could twist facts into fiction, and fiction was starting to look pretty convenient. That made two: Lucien with his paranoia and flash drives, Estelle with her weary cynicism and talk of cremated manuscripts. The third player was one I hadn't expected, Alton Travers, editor at Le Cordon Noir Press. I found him sipping vermouth at a rooftop bar in Soho, surrounded by too much tweed and not enough daylight. He was the one who'd reviewed the final proofs before they went to print. "I'll admit," he said, swirling his glass, "I suspected something was missing. The book felt disjointed, as if there was a thread yanked out, but Marcel wouldn't. Just stared at me and said, 'Not for your kind of reader.' Did you see an early copy with the full chapter?" "No, but I heard rumors. Marcel used to test new recipes on a select group. One of them was a critic, Jules Merton, food writer for Gastronome Weekly. Marcel served him something he called the Crimson Lamb, a dish no one's seen since. Rumor was it was part of the missing 10. Did Merton say anything? Only that it was divine and unforgivable. Then he wrote a review so vague it could have been a haiku. And just like that, our fourth suspect was on the table. Jules Merton, critic and former confidant of Marcel Chou, who'd vanished from his column 6 months ago claiming sensory fatigue. I tracked him to a rustic farmhouse upstate, where he raised heirloom tomatoes and mistrust in equal measure. Merton greeted me with a smirk and a trowel. "Still chasing ghosts of garlic?" he said. "You city folks never change." I cut the pleasantries. "Did you see the missing chapter?" He chuckled. "Taste is its own confession. Yes, I ate the dishes. No, I never saw the text. But I can tell you this, whatever's missing, it wasn't just culinary. It was dangerous." Marcel wasn't proud of it. He was afraid. That raised the stakes. Recipes that make chefs nervous and editors evasive. I smelled more than cardamom. By the time I reported back to Wolfe, the brownstone felt different, tense, as if the orchids sensed something out of place. Wolfe listened silently while I laid out the facts. 4 names, 4 motives, no proof. Lucien, bitter and overlooked. Estelle, loyal but exhausted. Travers, curious and professional. Merton, cryptic and unnerved. Wolfe closed his eyes, fingertips pressed together like the world's sleepiest chess master. "There is a 5th, he said finally. I blinked. "Come again?" "There is a 5th person with motive and means, someone who benefits if the chapter remains lost." I waited. He didn't elaborate. Typical. He tapped his notebook with one thick finger and said, "Tomorrow, bring Saul. We must verify what has not been claimed." And with that, the circle was set. suspects with secrets, lies plated like hors d'oeuvres, and Wolfe preparing to dine on revelation. I had a feeling the main course was still to come. The next morning, Wolfe gave me a narrowed glance over his poached eggs and pointed to the notepad on his desk with a single word: proceed. That was Wolfe's way of saying, "You're about to run all over town while I sit here with breakfast and solve the mystery from the comfort of my chair." I pocketed the list he'd written in his exacting block letters and stepped out into the city's restless morning with the same feeling I always got before digging into something knotted, curious, cautious, and already thinking 3 moves ahead. First on Wolfe's list was a place called La Cuisine Fantôme, the underground kitchen Marcel Chaux used during his last year in New York. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was where chefs with reputations too precious for public failure went to test the untestable. It took me 3 calls and a cash favor to a doorman with aspirations of truffle hunting before I got the address. A basement space in Tribeca beneath a shuttered wine bar. The place looked abandoned until you noticed the spice rack nailed to the door. I knocked twice. A tall, narrow man with a chef's coat opened the door. No name, just a raised eyebrow. "Lucien sent me," I said. "About the chapter." He gave a quiet grunt and let me in. The kitchen was immaculate, too clean for something supposedly forgotten. A row of burners gleamed under industrial lights, and a handwritten chalkboard listed dishes from several cuisines with dates and initials. One caught my eye: CL10, MC plus LM, dated 11 months ago. I pointed at it. "Still using this?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not since Marcel disappeared." "Did you see the chapter?" "No one saw the chapter, but we cooked it, all 10 dishes. Marcel numbered them, kept his notes locked in a safe. The key, only Marcel and Lucien had it. You ever notice someone else poking around?" His expression shifted. "Estelle came by once. Said she was looking for an apron she left behind, but she didn't take anything, as far as I know." I wrote that down, thanked him, and left. A visit to a phantom kitchen might sound glamorous, but all I had was a chalkboard and a name written in chalk. Useless unless I could tie it to something solid. Wolfe's second name on the list: Saul Panzer. I didn't need to track him down. Saul had already parked himself in the front parlor by the time I got back. Wolfe had sent word to follow a lead quietly, and Saul, being Saul, already had progress. He was sipping chamomile tea and scribbling in his tiny green notebook. "Got something?" I asked. He nodded. "The flash drive Lucien gave you?" I traced the metadata. It had been modified 2 days before he handed it to you. "So not old notes?" "Newly compiled. Which means if he's telling the truth about writing them years ago, he's also hiding when he reconstructed them. Could be innocent. Could be fraud." I went upstairs and gave Wolfe the update. He barely acknowledged it, which meant he'd already guessed. He gestured at the last name on his list: Jules Merton, the food critic. Wolfe had underlined the name. Twice. Not common for him, so I made the trip upstate again. Merton's farmhouse looked the same: red siding, suspicious geese, and a tomato garden so symmetrical it made you uneasy. He greeted me in overalls, holding a trowel and chewing sunflower, seeds like a man with nothing left to fear. "I told you before," he said. "I tasted the dishes, not the paper." "Sure, but you left something out, something Marcel told you maybe. Something about fear." He stared at me for a moment, then turned back to his tomatoes. "Fine," he muttered. "He told me he thought someone was following him. Said one of the test tasters was trying to replicate the dishes on their own." "Did he say who?" "No, but he stopped hosting tastings after that." That put a new wrinkle on things. A secret competitor, a spy in the kitchen, or maybe just paranoia. I tried to press him, but he waved me off. "You want a name? Ask the publisher. Ask Alton Travers. He was at the last tasting. Marcel had him, there to make sure no one was stealing notes." Another name, another clue buried under 3 layers of garnish. I headed back to the city and found Travers at the Cordon Noir office, leaning over a draft board with the next book cover half-designed, and 3 assistants buzzing around like confused bees. "You didn't tell me you were at the tasting," I said. He blinked. "Didn't seem relevant." "It is now. What did you see?" Nothing dramatic. Marcel ran the show like a military op. No phones, no notebooks, no leaving until the plates were cleared. But Estelle wasn't there, which was strange. She typed everything. Then halfway through, Marcel took a call and disappeared into the back for 20 minutes. When he returned, he looked wrong, sweaty, nervous. What happened after? He ended the tasting abruptly, said dessert was cancelled. That was the last I saw him. I left him there with his drafts and distractions and returned to the brownstone. Wolfe was in his chair, eyes closed, hands folded. I gave him the play-by-play, the ghost kitchen, the chalkboard, Lucien's metadata misstep, Merton's nervous tomatoes, Travers' memory, and the missing dessert. He opened one eye. No mention of Estelle's whereabouts during the final tasting? None confirmed. Just that she wasn't there, he gave a grunt. We require confirmation. And Mr. Panza must check Lucien's financial records. I suspect he has purchased a rather specific insurance policy. For a cookbook? For the aftermath of a cookbook, Wolfe replied. Then he waved me off. That was Wolfe's way of saying, you've done enough for now, but the next step matters more. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a scotch and looked at the board where I'd pinned the suspects' names. Estelle, Lucien, Travers, Merton, and someone else. Someone Wolfe hadn't named, but was sure existed. Someone who'd tasted something. Too perfect to let it go. Someone who'd done more than plagiarize. They'd erased a chapter and rewritten the game. And Wolfe? He wasn't chasing recipes. He was chasing intent. It started small, so small that I almost didn't notice. The kind of detail that feels like clutter until Wolfe raises an eyebrow and suddenly you're neck-deep in significance. It was mid-afternoon, and I'd just come back from the post office with a padded envelope containing 3 international copies of Le Grand Appétit, one each from Paris, London, and Montreal. Wolfe, in one of his rare states of restlessness, wanted to compare versions for discrepancies. I handed him the books, poured Fritz a coffee on the way through the kitchen, and went upstairs to check my notes. When I came back down, Wolfe hadn't moved, but the French edition was closed, his eyes were on the corner of his desk, and his tone was as neutral as chilled broth. "Archie," he said, "what have you done with the index cards?" That's when I noticed it. The small file box Wolfe keeps on the far left of his desk, his sacred log of personal recipe notes and rare ingredients, was slightly ajar. Wolfe never leaves it ajar. He guards that thing like a tabernacle. It wasn't just the lid. The order of the cards had changed. Alphabetical by strictest rule, always, but the card for sumac Persian red was out of sequence, placed after tarragon. I blinked. Not me. Nor Fritz. That left one conclusion. Someone had opened it. Recently. And they'd done it here in the heart of the brownstone. Wolfe hadn't heard them. I hadn't. But they'd gotten close enough to touch his most private records and clumsy enough to leave a breadcrumb behind. Wolfe didn't rage. He didn't fume. He simply reached for his intercom and buzzed Saul Panza. When Saul arrived, 20 minutes later, Wolfe greeted him with a single instruction. Check for signs of forced entry. Examine the lock on the file box. I believe we've had an unscheduled visitor. Saul nodded and got to work like a man who'd cracked open a dozen hidden safes and didn't get flustered by a wooden drawer. Meanwhile, Wolfe turned to me and said, "Review everyone who's entered the house in the past 72 hours, even briefly. That's a short list. You, me, Fritz, Horowitz, the publisher, and Travers. Travers, the least suspicious by manner and thus the most dangerous by calculation." He tapped the desk. "You'll also check for prints." I had to smile. "You think he left one?" "No. But he'll believe we found one. That will serve us just as well." That was Wolfe in a nutshell. He didn't need to catch you in the act. He just needed you to believe you'd been caught. Fritz confirmed that Travers had stepped into the office the previous afternoon, alone, for just under 5 minutes, while Wolfe took a call in the dining room. I remembered it now. An awkward pause, a stray compliment about the chairs, and a brief look toward Wolfe's desk when he thought no one was watching. No one but me. "Nothing forced," Saul reported from the office. "No damage to the lock, no scratches." Whoever opened it had either access or skill. I'd bet on access. So would Wolfe. We agreed not to confront Travers yet, not until Wolfe had a firmer grip on motive. But I knew something now that I hadn't known before. This wasn't about culinary rivalry anymore. Someone had come into Wolfe's sanctum, touched his tools, and maybe, just maybe, taken something. That night, Wolfe stayed up past 11. That's practically a panic state for him. He had me bring all the copies of Le Grand Appétit and arrange them on the dining table. He flipped through the indices, murmured to himself about subtle shifts in syntax, and finally settled on a bizarre observation. Page 224, he said. In the French edition only, there is a reference to jus sanguin de mouton. The English editions translate this as braised lamb reduction. That is an error. How so? Jus sanguin does not translate to braised. It translates to blooded. A very particular method, rare, rejected by most culinary schools for being too brutal, too raw. Sounds charming. It was also the unofficial name Lucien once gave to the missing 10th dish, the one Merton referred to in his divine and unforgivable review. Wolfe looked at me then, with that heavy, terrible stillness that usually means someone's made a move, and he's about to answer with checkmate. We have an imposter. Come again? The chapter was removed, he said, but someone inserted a reference back in, a subtle, coded insertion. Why? To create confusion? To hint at authenticity? Or to lead the reader to a dish that was deliberately buried? And you think Travers did it? I think Travers couldn't have done it alone. He doesn't read French, he didn't attend all 10 tastings, but someone else did. Lucien? Wolfe's silence was the kind that required no answer. He was already thinking 3 moves ahead. We convened a short meeting the next morning, just me, Wolfe, and Saul. Fritz hovered nearby, quiet but watchful. Wolfe laid it all out, the rearranged file cards, the corrupted metadata on Lucien's flash drive, the odd translation in the French edition, and the timeline of who had access to what and when. I believe, Wolfe said calmly, someone is trying to rebuild the missing chapter, not to reclaim it, but to control it, to own it in a way they never could when it was collaborative. Saul scratched his chin. Lucien? Lucien is a romantic. He believes in theft, not in strategy. But Estelle, she's exhausted, yes, but she is precise. She typed everything. She remembered everything. And if she believed Marcel had betrayed Lucien or her, she might find restoration not in revenge, but in authorship. You're saying she's writing it now? I am saying, Wolfe replied, that someone entered this house to find an ingredient Marcel used only once, documented nowhere but my private index. And unless the thief is a chef themselves, they needed help decoding the recipe. A beat of silence passed. So what's next? I asked. Wolfe smiled faintly. We bait the hook. I should have known he'd say that. He stood, a rare event, and walked 3 steps to the wall safe behind his bookshelf. From it he withdrew a single sheet of paper folded 3 times, sealed in a plastic sleeve. This, he said, is a facsimile. A forgery of the final recipe Marcel never published. Saul, you will place this inside the spine of the Paris edition and ensure Estelle knows it has arrived. How? You'll return the book to her personally, under the pretense of archival preservation. She'll assume it is real. And if she takes the bait? I asked. Wolfe's smile widened, thin as a paring knife. Then she will try to finish what was never hers to begin with, and when she does, we shall be ready. And just like that, the trespass wasn't subtle anymore. It was open season inside. The brownstone. 2 days passed after we planted Wolfe's forgery in the Paris edition. 2 days of nothing but waiting, pacing, and pretending we weren't springing a trap. Wolfe, of course, was unfazed. He spent those 48 hours reading Pliny's Natural History in the original Latin and consuming unreasonable amounts of Fritz's peach tarts. Me? I was running reconnaissance like a bloodhound on espresso, checking in with Saul, reviewing hotel surveillance, and confirming that Estelle had, in fact, received the book, signed for it, thanked Saul politely, and never once let on that she noticed anything out of the ordinary, which of course meant she absolutely had. By the 3rd morning, the pressure finally cracked. At precisely 6:42 a.m., a time Wolfe considers uncivilized, a courier arrived with an envelope addressed to Mr. Nero Wolfe, confidential. Fritz found it wedged in the gate and brought it to the office like it was ticking. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short, typed message: "You are playing a dangerous game." That recipe was buried for a reason. Stop now, or the truth will go to print. My way. See, there was no signature, no return address, no fingerprints. But there didn't need to be. C for shoe? Possibly. But we both knew Marcel was long dead. If not in body, then in relevance. This was someone else claiming the mantle. Someone with enough confidence to threaten Wolfe in his own house. I handed the note to Wolfe. He read it once, then set it aside like a wine list he didn't ask for. "They've taken the bait," he said. "They believe the recipe is real." So, Estelle? She is the only one who knows what the original looked like, but the note, it's theatrical. She would never threaten. She would grieve or retaliate subtly. This is louder, angrier. You're thinking Lucien, possibly, or Travers, or a third collaborator we haven't met yet. I raised a brow. There's a third? There's always a third, Archie. Recipes are rarely born in pairs. Wolfe instructed me to visit the publisher's office again and make noise. Loud, suspicious, annoying noise. My specialty. The goal? Pressure. Whoever had written that note was bluffing, and Wolfe wanted to push them past the bluff. So I went to Cordon Noir that afternoon, walked straight into Horowitz's office, and dropped the note on his desk. "I'm told you have a leak," I said. "And Wolfe thinks it's coming from your end." Horowitz looked like I'd accused him of spitting in the consommé. "We have NDAs thicker than your neck. No one leaks from this house." "Then explain this." He read the note twice and paled. "We've been receiving emails, anonymous tips, claims that we're publishing a counterfeit, that the real recipes are being held ransom." "By who?" "They won't say, but they've threatened to release a correction edition online unless we acknowledge shared authorship." "And you didn't think to mention this before?" "I thought it was a crank. Or Lucien fishing for attention. Marcel never credited anyone. If there's a collaborator, they don't legally exist." "But they emotionally exist," I said, standing. "And Wolfe thinks someone wants more than a byline. Someone wants to erase Chu's name entirely and rebuild the legacy from scratch." I left him sweating and went straight to Travers' office. He wasn't there. His assistant claimed he was on leave, defective that morning. Suspicious? Sure, but not conclusive. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe had Saul combing through Estelle's email metadata. Quietly, of course, and me re-reviewing every physical copy of the book we had. I was halfway through the Canadian edition when I noticed something odd. "Wolfe," I said, holding up the spine, "this one's been re-glued." He looked up from his orchid journal. "How?" "Microscopically uneven. There's a crease along the gutter, but no corresponding wear on the paper. Someone tampered with it." I cracked the spine carefully, and there it was. Another recipe. This one wasn't Wolfe's forgery. This one was real, typed in an old manual typewriter font, slightly yellowed. The title, Epilogue, Sanguin d'agneau et fenouil noir. It was written in French, with margin notes in two different hands, one fluid and cursive, likely Marcel's, the other more angular and tentative, possibly Estelle's. The instructions were intense, bordering on obsessive. Temperatures measured to the decimal, garnish to be harvested at dusk. There was even a tasting note, to serve without apology. For no one who tastes this shall forget who made it. Wolfe read the page slowly, reverently. "This," he murmured, "is the real final dish." I leaned in. "Then who planted it? Not us." "No. Someone attempting to prove authenticity, to force our hand, to say, 'Here, you've caught me. Now what?'" That night, things escalated further. Fritz returned from his afternoon market trip, visibly shaken. "My notebook," he said, "the one I keep for daily menus, someone's taken it." Wolfe froze. "When?" "I left it on the kitchen counter. It's always there." "And when did you last see it?" 2 hours ago. That narrowed it. The notebook wasn't just a meal plan. Fritz often scribbled Wolfe's rare ingredient stock and comments Wolfe, made in passing. Flavor pairings, ingredient ratios, even guest preferences. If someone took that, they weren't just stealing a grocery list, they were stealing Wolfe's culinary brain. Wolfe stood, again, and walked into the kitchen. He didn't say a word. He scanned the counter, the cabinets, the spice shelf. Then he turned back to me and said, "Call the suspects, all of them, one by one, here, tomorrow, noon." "All of them?" "Yes. Including Lucien, including Estelle." "And if Travers can be found, him too?" "Why?" "Because someone has crossed a line, and I am tired of waiting." That night, Wolfe sat in silence. No reading, no orchids, just a chair, a room, and a mind piecing together the moves of someone who had turned a missing chapter into a manifesto. By morning, the office would become a courtroom, and Wolfe would be the judge, jury, and executioner, armed not with laws, but with logic. At precisely 12 noon, Wolfe's office became the most uncomfortable room in New York. 4 chairs were lined up across from Wolfe's desk, not 1 inch apart, like pews facing judgment. Wolfe sat behind his desk, arms folded, eyes half-lidded. He said nothing at first. Fritz stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Saul Panzer occupied his usual shadowy corner, hands in his coat pockets, face unreadable. Me. I was parked in the red, armchair, notepad out, trying to look casual. Lucien Marceau arrived first, wearing a scarf like it owed him money, and muttering in French about injustice. Estelle Chou came 10 minutes later, composed, reserved, dressed in the kind of grey silk. That says I know where this is going. Travers was last, hair damp, shirt wrinkled, nervous in a way that made you wonder if he'd even slept. Wolfe hadn't summoned Jules Merton, the food critic. He was already out of the game. The real players were all in the room. "Thank you," Wolfe began at last, "for your punctuality. It is a courtesy I rarely receive and never forget." No one spoke. Wolfe tapped his fingers together. "You are here because a crime has been committed, not a murder, though that would have required fewer footnotes. Rather, a betrayal of authorship, a manipulation of trust, and the trespass of this house by someone who believed they were clever enough to outwit me." Still no one spoke. Wolfe's gaze moved to Lucien. "Mr. Marceau, you claimed authorship of the missing chapter. You presented me with a flash drive containing 10 recipes. You implied Chou had stolen them." Lucien sat upright. "He did. We wrote them together. I was his shadow. You lied," Wolfe cut in. "The metadata on the file indicates it was compiled just days ago. You reconstructed, poorly, from memory and desperation. That is forgery, not authorship." Lucien flushed but said nothing. Wolfe turned to Estelle. "Madame Chou, you denied keeping any drafts. You claimed your husband destroyed all documentation. But yesterday a recipe surfaced, hidden in the Paris edition of Le Grand Appétit, one typed in your hand." Estelle blinked once. "I didn't plant it." "I believe you. You would not make such a clumsy gesture. You are too precise." He turned to Travers. "Mr. Travers, you left your post at Cordon Noir without explanation. The same day a threat arrived at my office." Travers shifted in his seat. "That was coincidence. You also had access to the French edition." "And motive. You are the only person in this room who stands to benefit financially if the scandal around the missing chapter explodes. A second print run, a tell-all exposé, a public unraveling of Chou's legacy. I didn't write the note." "No," Wolfe said. "You didn't." Now he stood, a rare thing, signaling the gravity of what came next. "This is not about who wrote the chapter. We know Marcel Chou composed it, with input from Mr. Marceau and typing from his wife. Nor is it about who destroyed the originals. Marcel did, likely out of fear that his reputation could not survive such aggressive, experimental work." He began to pace, slowly. "This is about who attempted to reclaim the chapter, by force, deception and intrusion. Someone who knew the recipes or had access to someone who did. Someone who wanted to finish what Chou had started, not for legacy but for leverage." Wolfe looked at Estelle. "You were the keeper of the drafts. You told us they were gone." "They were," she said quietly. "Until someone broke into my flat 2 weeks ago." Lucien's head jerked. "What?" She turned to him. "You didn't know? My apartment was searched. I didn't report it. There was nothing missing. Or so I thought, until Fritz's notebook disappeared. Someone's compiling, Wolfe said. First the drafts, then the recipe hidden in my own brownstone, then the threat. He turned to Saul. Mr. Panzer, would you kindly show them what you found? Saul stepped forward and placed a stack of photographs on Wolfe's desk. Surveillance footage, Saul explained. Taken from a camera I planted in Ms. Cho's apartment 3 days ago, after the second intrusion. Look closely. The photos showed a blurred figure entering Estelle's flat through a fire escape. The frame caught his profile. Lucien stood. That's not me. No, Wolfe said. It's Travers. Travers bolted halfway to standing before sitting again, as if realizing it wouldn't help. I can explain. I hope you can, Wolfe interrupted, because what follows will require explanation indeed. You entered Estelle's home. You removed her carbon copies. You planted the completed dish in the Paris edition. You forged the threat. And then, 2 nights ago, you entered this house and took Fritz's notebook. Estelle stared at Travers in horror. Why? Because, Wolfe said, he was rewriting the chapter. Lucien scoffed. He's not a chef. No, but he has one. Wolfe turned to me. Archie, would you kindly bring in our guest? I opened the hallway door and ushered in a man in a dark apron with a thick French accent and the bruised pride of someone used to working behind the scenes. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, this is Chef Nicolas Duret, former sous-chef to Marcel Choux, recently hired by one Mr. Alton Travers for private consulting. Travers buried his face in his hands. Wolfe delivered the final blow. Travers funded Duret to replicate the dishes using stolen notes, not to publish the chapter, but to sell it as a separate brand. Unfinished Choux, a line of experimental products he would present as rediscovered genius, while positioning himself as the editor who saved the lost work. Estelle looked murderous. You stole from all of us. I paid him, Travers blurted, pointing at Duret. He agreed. We weren't hurting anyone, just reviving brilliance. By trespassing, forging and manipulating? Wolfe asked. You disrespected not just the work, but its silence. Marcel chose to bury it. He looked at Estelle. You may wish to pursue civil charges, but here, justice has already been served. Estelle stood. I'll let the lawyers decide. Lucien followed her out. He didn't look back. Travers remained seated, sweating. Wolfe didn't dismiss him. He didn't have to. After everyone had gone, Wolfe sat back down, exhausted but composed. I looked at him. Was it worth it? He nodded once. There are recipes, he said, meant to be forgotten. But when others try to unbury them for profit, one must remind them some flavors are not theirs to serve. Then he rang for Fritz. Dinner was beef with fennel and no fanfare. By the next day, word had started to circulate, not in headlines or blogs, but in the tight, murmured conversations of publishing assistants, restaurant insiders, and sous chefs who knew enough not to write things down. The scandal hadn't exploded publicly yet. Wolfe had no intention of rushing it. Truth, in his view, was best served like a proper consommé, clear, concentrated, and after sufficient reduction. But before any final moves could be made, Wolfe had one final orchestration in mind, the confrontation. He told me that morning, in between sips of barley tea, we will gather them again, here today, but this time not as witnesses, as suspects, every one of them. I didn't argue. Now the pattern was clear. The truth had been dug out. What Wolfe wanted was not facts but confession, and for that, he needed all the players seated in front of him, facing the weight of his logic and the trap he'd built from their contradictions. Noon came, and the room filled again. Lucien Marceau walked in first, more composed than last time, wearing a jacket at least 2 sizes too dramatic. Estelle followed, tight-lipped and unreadable, clutching a small leather-bound book in her gloved hands. Alton Travers entered last, shoulders slumped, looking as if he were still trying to decide whether to deny everything or feign epiphany. This time, Wolfe didn't wait. Let us be direct, he began, his tone flat and formal. You are all complicit in different ways in the attempted resurrection of a chapter that was never meant to see light. Lucien bristled. So now preserving history is a crime. It is, Wolfe said, when done without consent. And when one attempts to rewrite history not to preserve, but to dominate it. He gestured toward Estelle. You had the original notes. You preserved them. But you also buried them, until someone else forced your hand. Estelle gave a small, I never wanted them published. But Marcel's work was being dragged through fiction. Someone had to stop it. And you, Mr. Marceau, Wolfe continued, contributed by misrepresenting your role, your documentation, and your timing. I never denied my motives, Lucien snapped. I just wanted credit. My name. Is that so wrong? No, Wolfe replied. Wanting credit is not wrong. But manipulating the narrative, lying about evidence, and aiding in a campaign of intimidation is... He turned to Travers. And you, sir, were the linchpin. You had access to the publisher's archives, influence over public perception, and you hired Nicolas Duret to reverse-engineer dishes you had no right to replicate. You stole Fritz's notebook from this very kitchen, and you used that theft to legitimize a fraud. Travers was silent. His hands trembled on the armrests of the chair. Wolfe let the silence stretch, then finally leaned forward. This meeting is not to apportion legal blame. That is the business of courts and contracts. This meeting is to assign moral blame. You each in your way treated the legacy of a dead man as a blank canvas to redraw. He pointed to the small stack of papers in front of him. Here is a reconstructed version of the missing chapter, assembled from Estelle's preserved drafts, Lucien's reconstructed versions, and Duret's derivatives. A stew of truths and lies. We will not publish it. We will not circulate it. We will seal it, he passed. It to me, and I placed it in a thick manila envelope, then into Wolfe's safe behind the bookshelf. The lock clicked. Travers shifted. You can't just bury it. I can, Wolfe replied. Because he did. He looked directly at Estelle. Why did Marcel destroy the originals? Her voice was faint, but steady. He said they were dangerous. That they didn't belong to a tradition. That they were chaos with seasoning. He was afraid of what people would do with them. Wolfe nodded. And now we know what people did do with them. He stood, again the second time in as many days, which meant he was truly resolved. Let me be clear, I will not go to the press. I will not ruin reputations. But if any of you attempt to monetize, fictionalize, or serialize the lost chapter again, I will. I will name names, dates, recipes, and I will destroy the illusion you are trying to sell. He pointed one final time. This is not a warning. This is a boundary. Silence again. Estelle stood slowly, eyes focused on Wolfe. Thank you, she said, for protecting it. Lucien followed, muttering under his breath. He never would have done this to me if I'd been French. Travers hesitated at the door, then looked back. You could have made a fortune with it. Wolfe didn't blink. I already have everything I need. A chair, silence, and integrity. When they were gone, I let out the breath I'd been holding. Think. They'll stay quiet. Not all, Wolfe said, but enough. Estelle will preserve, Lucien will bluster, Travers will sulk, none will risk exposure again. I poured myself a coffee and looked at the now empty room. That recipe, I said, the real one, you've read it. Was it any good? Wolfe didn't answer. He simply stared out the window for a long moment, then said, it was extraordinary, and entirely wrong. He picked up his book and returned to his chair, and with that, the matter of the cookbook with the extra chapter was sealed, morally, intellectually, and literally. The brownstone was quiet again. But somewhere in the world, I figured someone was still chasing that last forbidden dish, convinced that genius could be bottled and sold. Wolfe knew better. He didn't chase ghosts. He fed the living. The next morning, the brownstone was quiet, eerily so. Not the comfortable kind of quiet that came with Fritz simmering veal stock in the kitchen and Wolfe pruning his orchids upstairs. No, this was the stillness that follows a storm, when the debris hasn't quite settled and the last gust of wind hasn't finished its work. I was sitting in the office going over the last week's notes, suspects, contradictions, visits, files, fake recipes, and that single flashpoint moment when Travers realized Wolfe had outplayed him. When Wolfe entered, a manila envelope in hand, the chapter, he said simply, placing it on his desk. The real one. I leaned forward not to open it, but to confirm. So you are keeping it? He nodded. Sealed, untouched, as it should remain. He lowered himself into his chair with the kind of weariness he only showed after a case that disturbed the sanctity of food, of structure, of logic. The temptation to read it again is immense, but some things do not improve with familiarity. They decline, lose their sharpness. He tapped the envelope. This chapter is one of them. So, I said, give me the final verdict. What was the play? Start to finish. Wolfe steepled his fingers and spoke with the calm certainty of a man who had watched it all unfold while we scrambled through kitchens, publishing houses, and old apartments. Marcel Chou wrote the final chapter alone. He excluded it from Le Grand Appétit because he feared it would tarnish his legacy. It was not a collection of refined cuisine. It was a manifesto. Intense, violent, even. He used techniques no reputable chef would publish: blood reductions, iron filtrations, even an emulsification process that involved bone marrow as a thickener. Brilliant, yes, but unsellable. I nodded. So why the myth? Because he spoke of it too much to too many. Lucien, Estelle, Travers. Each heard fragments. Each wanted control. After Marcel's death, Lucien tried to reconstruct it. Estelle tried to forget it. Travers tried to own it. But none of them had the complete truth. No, Wolfe said. Only Estelle did. She preserved it in secret, knowing that Lucien's half-memories and Travers' commercial ambitions would corrupt it. He paused. Then the publisher announced the global release of Le Grand Appétit, foreign editions, press tours, and Estelle knew the moment was coming, that someone, Lucien or Travers, would revive the legend and fake it, deform it, claim it. She reached out to you. No, he said. Lucien did, but Estelle saw the opportunity. She let it unfold, thinking perhaps the deception would consume itself. It did not. Instead, it crept into our brownstone. First through Lucien's planted flash drive, then through Travers's theft of Fritz's notebook. That was the turning point. That notebook, I said, was full of your ingredient logs. Indeed, Wolfe said, and among those logs was a mention of Persian red sumac, a rare spice Marcel used exactly once in a dish no one had seen before. Whoever stole the notebook saw it as confirmation that they were close to reconstructing the real chapter, so they moved quickly, too quickly. I remembered the moment Travers stood up during our confrontation, eyes wide when he realized Saul had footage of him inside Estelle's apartment. The man never had the patience for Wolfe's slow boil. That was his weakness. Why did he plant the recipe in the French edition? To force us, Wolfe said. To force me. He thought if I saw it, recognized the phrasing, the structure, the ingredients, I would verify it, authenticate it publicly. Then he could claim to have discovered it and launch his unfinished Chou brand. Wolfe let out a breath. But he underestimated Estelle. She may have been quiet, but she was always watching. When she saw what Travers had done, breaking into her flat, stealing her annotations, inserting her work without permission, she brought me the original, the true final recipe, and said only this: bury it again. Why come to you? Because she trusted I would respect it. We sat in silence for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been nagging at me since the start. Was it murder? Wolfe blinked. Pardon? Not literal, I said. But morale. Marcel buried his work. They tried to dig it up, to warp it, to put his name on something he deliberately removed. That feels like murder to me. Wolfe considered it. No, he said at last. It was not murder. It was desecration. The difference is subtle but significant. Murder ends a life. Desecration disturbs what remains. I scribbled that down. It was a Wolfism if ever I'd heard one. Will Estelle face any fallout? I asked. She will disappear, Wolfe said. Voluntarily. No interviews, no statements. She will be known as the woman who chose silence. That is rare enough to be remembered. And Lucien. He will keep telling anyone who listens that the chapter was his. He will be denied every time. The real culinary world knows better. I stretched and stood. Well, I suppose we're done. Wolfe raised a finger. One final matter. He opened his drawer and pulled out the small card with Travers's scrawled handwriting, the original threat. You asked me if it was written by Lucien or Travers, Wolfe said. I nodded. It was neither. It was written by Durette. The chef Travers hired. He panicked after planting the recipe and sent the note in hopes of derailing us before Wolfe got too close. So even he was trying to sabotage the plan. No, Wolfe said. He was trying to protect it. He believed the chapter should be published, but with credit to himself as the one who resurrected it. I let out a low whistle. A circle of thieves, each stealing from the other. Yes, Wolfe said, and now the circle is closed. He stood, walked to the safe and placed the envelope inside. Then he shut it, locked it, and returned to his chair. You won't ever open it again, I asked. No, Wolfe replied. And neither will anyone else. The chapter is preserved, but it is not for serving. Fritz knocked lightly, then entered. Lunch is ready. Wolfe smiled faintly. Good. Something honest. We left the office behind, its secrets sealed. And as we sat down to smoked duck and wild fennel, I couldn't help but think. The world may chase myths and lost chapters, but Wolfe, he chased the truth. And then he put it away, where it belonged. Life at the brownstone returned to its usual tempo, which meant an outward calm masking the machinery of obsessive routine. Wolfe resumed his twice-daily sessions with the orchids. Fritz rotated the menu back to spring vegetables, and I found myself, as ever, toggling between errands, reports, and a standing list of people who still owed us checks. But beneath all, that polish, the case of the missing cookbook chapter still hovered, not as a scandal, not even as gossip, but as a strange kind of ghost. Not the kind that haunts, but the kind that lingers in the corners of a well-kept room, politely refusing to leave. A week had passed since Wolfe locked the real recipe in the safe and delivered his verdict to the small circle of conspirators. Not one of them had made a move. Estelle Chou had left New York the day after the gathering. Her lawyer sent a short note, grateful, dignified, final. She'd donated her share of Marcel's royalties to a culinary education trust. Lucien, on the other hand, went the opposite direction. He did 3 podcast interviews in 5 days, each one more dramatic than the last. He claimed Wolfe had buried French genius to protect corporate cronies. The third time he said it, he started to believe it. But he never published the recipes. Probably because he never had them. As for Travers, he was done. The publisher fired him quietly, citing contractual breaches and ethical lapses. The last we heard, he was considering a ghostwriting gig for a vegan influencer. Fitting. Wolfe said nothing. He didn't need to. Justice had been administered not through the courts, but through the one thing Wolfe respected most: quiet, precise exposure. The media never got the real story. They got fragments. Missing chapter. Rumored in Chou's cookbook. Former sous chef claims recipe theft. Publisher shakes up staff amid creative dispute, but never the full dish. That's the thing about a Nero Wolfe case. It never spills. It simmers, then seals. One afternoon I found Wolfe sitting by the open window in the dining room, a rare thing for him. The sunlight hit the edge of his chair, but he didn't seem to notice. I set down his tea and took the seat across from him. You haven't spoken about the recipe, I said. I have said what needs to be said. Sure. But you haven't said what you felt about it. He gave me that look, the one that says I'm poking where there's no pie. But he surprised me by answering. It was magnificent, he said. Technically, structurally, imaginatively, but it was not nourishing. There was no humility in it, only conquest. It sought not to feed, but to impress. I nodded slowly. So it was genius. It was performance, he replied. Genius is quiet, this was loud. That stayed with me. Wolfe never used more words than necessary. If he'd said the dish was loud, he meant it clashed with the soul of cuisine. He looked out the window. You know, Archie, the thing most people misunderstand about food is that they think its purpose is novelty, innovation. But food is not invention. It is memory. It is culture. It is repetition elevated. That recipe didn't fit that, I said. No. It wanted to erase what came before it. That is not food. That is ego. There it was. Wolfe had seen the truth, not just of the theft, but of the recipe itself. It wasn't the content that had offended him. It was the intent. The missing chapter wasn't a culinary contribution. It was a monument to ambition. And monuments, Wolfe believed, belonged to history, not to dinner. A few days later, Saul dropped by with a short update. Jules Merton, the critic-turned-tomato farmer, had penned a letter in a niche food journal. Not a confession, not even a story, just an essay about restraint, about how the greatest chefs know when to discard the masterpiece, when not to serve the perfect course. It didn't mention Wolfe, or Choux, or the chapter, but it might as well have. Wolfe read it, set it aside, and muttered, "At least one of them understood." I handled the cleanup, returned the loaned foreign editions of the cookbook, secured Fritz's notebook in a safer place, replied to the polite but nosy inquiries from a certain editor at the New York Times. Each reply was a masterpiece of saying nothing. Wolfe taught me that. On a personal note, the whole affair made me think differently about authorship, about credit. I mean, we all want recognition. Lucien did. Travers did. Even Estelle in her quiet way. But when you see what people will do to grab it, to bend a legacy into something they can claim, it makes you wonder if credit's really worth the cost. Wolfe didn't care for credit. He cared for clarity, which in the end probably made him more dangerous than any of them. One night late, I came downstairs and found the safe open. Wolfe was seated at his desk. The envelope with the recipe was still sealed, untouched. He didn't open it, didn't even look at it, just sat there with it in the open, as if to remind himself it still existed, and that resisting it was the last act of control. I didn't say anything, just turned and went back upstairs. By the next morning it was locked away again. The case never made our official files. Wolfe didn't dictate it. I didn't record it. There was no client, no invoice, no legal resolution. Just a set of actions, a set of truths, and one sealed envelope that would never see the inside of a kitchen. Weeks passed. New cases came. Missing persons, blackmail, fraud, our usual menu. Wolfe's world returned to its natural balance. But every now and then, I'd glance at the bookshelf at that safe and remember the cookbook with the extra chapter. The chapter that nearly rewrote a legend, and instead ended up reinforcing it. On a quiet Sunday, over sauté chanterelles and risotto, Wolfe finally broke his silence. "Archie, yes, promise me something, sure. If I die first and you are tempted to open the envelope, don't." I looked at him. "You afraid of what it contains?" "No, I know what it contains. I'm afraid of what it inspires." I nodded. And that was that. The truth, once again, remained in Wolfe's domain, observed, understood, and contained. After the storm, there's always the silence, but in the brownstone, silence isn't absence, it's control. And Wolfe, more than anyone I've ever known, understands control. Not over people, not over power, but over meaning. That's why the envelope remained sealed. Not because of fear, not because of legal risks, but because some truths, once exposed, distort everything around them. 3 weeks had passed since the final confrontation. No more threats, no visits, no recipes floating through back channels, just the comforting rhythm of the house. Fritz at the stove, Wolfe in his chair, and me watching both like a man who's finally started to understand the rules of a game he's been playing for years. I asked him one evening, while he poured himself a second glass of cider, what if they try again? Estelle, Lucien, someone else. What if someone finds a way to publish it? He didn't look up. They won't. How do you know? Because I gave them something more valuable than a recipe. That got my attention. You gave them nothing. You gave them a warning. No, Wolfe said. I gave them clarity. I gave Estelle a way to respect her husband. I gave Lucien the knowledge that his version was never real. And I gave Travers the understanding that the real commodity was not the recipe, but the illusion of having it. I let that sink in. Wolfe hadn't just shut them down. He'd replaced their desire with certainty, the kind that makes people stop chasing ghosts. He glanced at me then, not smugly, but almost contemplative. You think I kept the chapter because I was protecting Marcel, or myself, or the sanctity of food? Well, yeah, you're wrong. He stood and walked to the bookshelf where the safe was still locked. I kept it, he said, because it represents a kind of temptation I know too well. The belief, that knowledge, raw, unprocessed, must always be shared, that everything must be exposed. It's a modern disease, and it is mistaken. I folded my arms. You're saying some truths are better buried? No. I'm saying some truths are complete in their disappearance. That stopped me. I'd chased 100 confessions with Wolfe, listened to liars fall apart under his precision, watched people shatter when they realized he knew. But I'd never heard him say this, never heard him admit that mystery sometimes had a purpose. He went on. There's an arrogance to exposure, a belief that uncovering is always right. Marcel understood this. He chose to omit that chapter, not because it was flawed, but because it was too much, too dense, too pointed. It would have made him famous in a different way, worshipped. But he knew what that kind of attention does. He looked at me. Would you want to be remembered for your most dangerous idea? I shook my head. No. Then you understand. I did. Maybe not fully, but enough. Later that week, Wolfe did something he almost never does. He invited Saul and Fritz to sit with us in the office, not for business, not for a briefing, but for dinner. Fritz served duck à l'orange with celeriac puree and a delicate herb jus. Wolfe insisted we eat in the office, surrounded by books and silence. It was his way of making the space sacred again, of cleansing it. After the plates were cleared, Wolfe raised his glass. To restraint, he said. The most difficult ingredient. Je ne master. We drank, and I realized that this case, this ridiculous, brilliant, maddening cookbook scandal, had changed him. Not visibly, not fundamentally, but deeply. Wolfe would go on taking cases. The orchids would still be pruned. The way rules would remain ironclad. But somewhere beneath that shell, a new understanding had bloomed. That sometimes the greatest victory is not revelation, but refusal. One night, weeks later, I was watching the rain fall against the window in the upstairs hallway. Something about it reminded me of Paris, the city Marcel came from, the city Lucien still longed for, the city Estelle had quietly abandoned. I wondered what they were all doing, if they'd made peace, if they still dreamed about the chapter, or if, like Wolfe, they'd learned to stop opening certain doors. I walked down to the office and found Wolfe in his chair, reading. I ever tell you, I said, that you scare me more when you don't talk than when you do. He looked up. That is because silence implies decision. Exactly, I said, dropping into the red armchair. So what did you decide? He closed the book. I've decided, he said, that some stories do not belong in the archive. They belong in memory. And memory does not require proof, I grinned. Then this one stays off the books, he nodded. There will be no file for the case of the cookbook with an extra chapter. No record, no copies, just a safe, and a man who understands why it must remain shut. I rose, walked to the bookshelf, and looked at the steel door behind the row. Of faux spines. I didn't touch it, didn't even think about the code. Then I turned back. Don't worry, I said. I won't open it. I know you won't, Wolfe said softly, because if you ever do, you'll be chasing not truth, but applause. And that, more than anything else, was the final lesson. Some mysteries aren't solved. They're chosen to be preserved, to be left intact, to remind us that the most powerful secrets are not the ones we share, but the ones we guard.